Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. And once again, it's a great pleasure to be with you again this evening. I want to thank so many of you that send us emails, text messages, tweets, or whatever, thanking us for the program. And it's always good to hear. And I hope you're also especially thanking EWTN because they're the ones that make this program possible. And it's a joy not only to be with you again each week, but I always look forward to my time with a guest. Shaun Rieley is our guest, former Evangelical Protestant. I don't know his story yet. I'm learning it with you. So let's relax and welcome Shaun to the program. Hello, Shaun.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here all the way from D.C.
That's right.
You're inside that beltway, right?
Inside the beltway, but just outside in Maryland. We were in D.C. for about 5 years, my wife and I, but when our daughter was born, we moved out to the Maryland side.
A little more sane side.
Yeah.
I hate to say that, but okay. Anyway,
Sure,
let's hear your story. Let's invite you to go way back and let's hear your spiritual journey.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in a very, very spiritual household, Christian household. Evangelical Protestant is what I would now call it. I didn't sort of have those words. We didn't call ourselves that.
No specific tradition, but more generic evangelical?
More generic, yeah. Very devout. My dad now, so my dad was raised Catholic in New York, and my mom was raised Methodist in Delaware. So I grew up in Delaware. They actually had met in D.C. and then decided to move back to where my mom was from to raise family on the farm. I have 11 brothers and sisters. I'm the oldest of 11 children. And
brought up on a farm.
Brought up on a farm. That's right.
Praise God.
In Delaware. So chicken farm, which is typical for Delaware. If you know anything about that.
Why is the word chicken funny in itself? I don't know. That's another subject. But
It is.
Chicken.
That's right. So, but yeah, very, very devout. We went to church every week, and a very, what I would call a very, very devout community of church community. We were there a lot. We were very involved. That was the kind of the core of our social activity was around the church, and so I had a very strong upbringing in Christianity and the fundamentals of the faith, in the scripture, and so forth. Went through and as I became a teenager, got involved in youth group and that sort of thing, and had an experience when I was about 14 with God, that sort of marked me out in a certain direction, I would say, kept me more or less on a path. I got so we were very involved in the youth group. I played drums for the church, played drums in the youth group. Evangelical churches have that sort of thing. And so, but as I got older, went off to college. I went to University of Delaware, so not a Christian school, state school. I started.
Did your faith survive from childhood into college?
It did, but in a sort of modified form. What I would say is that I never rejected it outright, although it toyed with other things, other ideas. I never rejected it outright, and I actually think, so I had in high school gotten involved in punk rock scenes. So I played in a punk rock band, Christian. We were all Christians, and we were involved in the Christian punk rock scene. That was a big kind of a big thing back in the 90s to 2000s. And so, we were playing, but we got involved in the sort of the broader punk rock scene too, not just the Christian world. And so we were kind of straddling two worlds in some ways. And so, as I went into college, I had this strong background, but I started to question some things, of course, as one does. But I think the punk rock thread is this: when faced with a world, a university world, if you want, that is sort of anti, or at least not explicitly Christian. I rebelled against that, right, in some sense. And so that's frankly, when I reflect on it, partly what helped me maintain at least some kind of semblance of faith, which was the rebellion against Christianity that I found at the university, in the secular university.
I'm not very familiar with punk rock. It
Sure.
wasn't my tradition at that time
Sure.
in my life. Is the genre of punk rock a rebellious? You know what I mean?
It is, and I mean in general, that's kind of where it comes from. You see the mohawks and the tattoos and So it's very punk rock. It's very rebellious punk rock. It's sort of at its core. But there's all different kinds of versions of it, all different kinds of
So I was thinking, if you got a foot in Christian punk rock and a Christian secular punk rock, I mean, those are worlds apart.
Well, they
in terms
are.
of the rebellion that's going on inside of you, also.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this kind of tension developing, and then I'm being exposed to all these different ideas at college and so forth, and so I'm trying to sort my way through it. But so I became interested in apologetics because I knew I wanted to hold on to that faith, but I wasn't sure quite what it would look like. I knew I was never an atheist. I probably would have called myself an agnostic at a certain point, but was searching, looking, Christian apologetics, but also sort of other worldviews and that sort of thing.
And with your dad as an ex-Catholic, and they must have had a true awakening of faith if they've gone from where they were to a more fundamentalist evangelical church.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's partly why. So just going back a little further, my dad, I would say, grew up in the '60s and the '70s, and it's tumultuous time for the church. He was, I would say, not well catechized. He also had a father who was traditional Irish Catholic who rejected Vatican II, root and branch, and would only go to Latin Mass and so forth, which isn't necessarily bad, but for him, he experienced it as legalistic, oppressive. His father was also an alcoholic. He was abusive in some cases, and so he just, I think, associated it with a lot of bad things.
So I'm assuming that what you got also from that, as you move on into this phase now, is that Catholic Church isn't really an option.
Sure. Yes. Although I became, in college, I did start toying with it a little bit. I went to Mass a couple of times, the local Catholic church in Newark, Delaware, where the University of Delaware is, and I sort of started exploring it. I was interested in the sort of aesthetic of the church, I would say. I think about, too, a little bit before this, my parents and I had gone to New York, and we had stopped by St. Patrick's in New York. And I recall now, when I reflect on it, thinking that, this is something else. This is something I've never experienced before. What is this thing that creates beauty like this? I don't know how to process it. It seemed so foreign to me in one sense, but it also seemed familiar in another sense because I saw, they're talking about Jesus, they're talking about all of the things that I knew, but I didn't quite know how to put it together. So I can, in some ways, trace it back to that experience of beauty at St. Patrick's.
Because we talk about the two worlds apart of your two punk rock worlds. You got your very plain evangelical sanctuary, maybe not even pews, and a rock band up in front. And then there's St. Patrick's.
Yes.
I mean, you've got liturgy where you didn't have one. You've
Sure.
got all the artwork. You got the beauty. I mean, there's
Yes.
worlds apart too.
Yes, absolutely. So just, so trying to reflect on all that and bring all that together in conjunction with the apologetics and the sort of intellectual aspects of it. It was sort of wrestling with all of this. And at the same time, I had sort of personally, in terms of my personal morality, my personal lifestyle, become very, very lax, we'll say. I remember reading St. Augustine at some point, give me chastity, but not yet. And I said,
Right.
that's me. Or that was me, that had been me at some point. And so, I think when I reflect on it, my faith became intellectualized in a lot of ways, but I had trouble figuring out how to live it. It was sort of something that I assented to intellectually, but I didn't know how to bring it into action.
Our guest is Shaun Rieley. That can be the danger of apologetics.
Sure.
Is everything can become very cerebral.
Yeah.
It can fit.
That's right.
You can have all the arguments,
That's
A,
right.
B, C, and D, and E.
That's right.
But
it's not there. You're not living it. And so while I was in college, after the Iraq War broke out, I joined the National Guard as an infantryman, Maryland National Guard, and took a semester off, went to basic training. That experience, in basic training, the only time you're allowed to leave and do anything that's not part of that is when you can go to church on Sundays. And so there, I had to pick a service to go to, and for whatever reason, I think it was mainly because of the timeline, that whatever the time of the Catholic Mass was the time that I wanted to go to church, and so I started going to the Catholic Mass in basic training. Came back, graduated from college, and then immediately got word that we were deploying. So I spent a year in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, as part of the Guard Force there, sitting in the towers and vehicle checkpoints and all that sort of thing. And during that time, I started discovering podcasts. Podcasts were a new thing at this point. And so I started
sitting in a tower for a lot of hours.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. So I had books and podcasts. Technically, you weren't supposed to bring them, but it's kind of winked at because look, you're sitting in a tower for 12 hours. What are you going to do? And so I started discovering, again, some more apologetics podcasts, names like Ravi Zacharias I began coming across. And he started dropping names like G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, of course, but I started going, who's this Chesterton guy? And then I remembered that at some point on EWTN, when I was in college and sort of exploring, I had seen something by Dale Alquist on G.K. Chesterton, and I started, and I put something together in my mind. So I ordered a couple of G.K. Chesterton books to read while I was on guard shift.
With all these, like Dale Alquist and a little bit of EWTN here,
Sure.
and you visited Mass there, were you leaning at all? Or was it just one data point of all the others?
It was one, at that point it was still one data point. But it's starting to build.
Okay.
But I would say it wasn't really leaning yet. And this is about, I came to the church in 2015, so this is 2006. So I still had 9 years before I would make the final leap. But so these are all things that are building. So then I came home from Cuba, and then immediately got word that we were deploying to Iraq.
Wow.
So turned around and found myself in Iraq in 2007 into 2008, and was in Baghdad, and that experience alone can create a kind of existential crisis in some ways. But one other thing I think about though is that there was this guard shack again, where I spent a lot of time, and there would be books in there which former rotations of troops had left behind or what have you. I remember I read the Da Vinci Code was one of the books that happened to be in there, but another book that happened to be in there was the Catholic Encyclopedia. So I read all the way through the Catholic Encyclopedia.
One volume version.
The one volume version. That's right. Yeah. So I read through, this is a paperback one volume version of the Catholic Encyclopedia.
I mean, it's still significant, but it's just not the set.
Well, sure. Precisely.
Right.
But I'm just kind of taking it all in, and by the way, contrasting it with the Da Vinci Code and trying to kind of make sense of that. And there were a couple of other kind of church conspiracy theory mystery books that were to happen to be, along with a whole bunch, probably 20 or 30 other books that were in there. But those were the ones that I was attracted to because those were the sort of the questions that I was asking myself. And again, more podcasts, sort of developing kind of questions, the questions that I was asking myself. But the questions are now becoming more formulated, I suppose, in my mind. I came home from there, and I, as many do, I kind of dismissed it all for a while, drank a lot from after Iraq, that is.
Would you? Well, you've got baggage you're bringing with you. At that point in your time, would you have thought yourself a Christian? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. I would have. Yes, I would have intellectually defended Christianity again as an intellectual proposition to be defended. But again, not living at all, and not really any concept of how to bring that into my life as a sort of a living thing. I moved to DC 2011, and all this time still reading. I remember I started dating my wife my wife in 2010, and she I remember when we first started dating, she asked me, "Do you really believe all this God stuff?" And I remember saying, I think I do. I think I do. I'm not sure, but I think I do. And so that just gives you a sense for where we both were at that point. And so we moved to DC together, not married yet. Let me say that. So we moved in together, but not married. And but again, I was still kind of exploring, thinking, all of this sort of thing. I started meeting people in DC. DC has a lot of, it's a strong Catholic community. I happened to I was working at the American Legion at the time. So I moved to DC to become, work in the legislative division of the American Legion. It was a big veterans organization. And so I was developing and pushing on Capitol Hill legislation designed to help veterans and that sort of thing. But across the street, if you know where it is, it's at 16th and K. Well, almost catty corner is Catholic Information Center.
Right.
So I noticed that, and I noted it, and I said, "That's interesting. Catholic Information Center. What is this?" Sort of go in every now and then and look around and see what's what, and check out the books and that sort of thing. And so again, slowly building, and now becoming. But now I'm definitely leaning. Are you worshiping at all? Praying at all? A bit. So I started experimenting with an evangelical church that's in the DC area that meets in a theater, and I was comfortable there in some senses, because it was very much what I grew up in, or similar to it, same kind of aesthetic, same kind of theology, that kind of thing. So I was comfortable there, but not completely comfortable there. And I think partly because I had developed to a point where I just wasn't satisfied with that anymore. All those things, all those data points along the way were starting to add up, and I was just not quite satisfied with what I was getting there. I had a hard time putting my finger on it, but that's where I was at that point. Then I think I can trace in some ways back around 2012, gay marriage became an issue, a big issue that everyone was debating at that point. Right. And I remember thinking that, first of all, I was going to have to come to a position on it, figure out how I thought about it, because it's what everybody was talking about. And so in trying to determine, I had an inkling that I was, rooted in my Christian faith, that I was opposed, but I was having a hard time articulating why. Moreover, I was living at the time with my not wife, with my girlfriend. And so, it kind of put me in a little bit of a moral crisis. I had leaned in one way, but I had a hard time articulating why. And I realized that in some ways, the way I was living was no better, maybe worse than what I was trying to oppose, or thinking I wanted to oppose. And so I started thinking seriously about how to formulate a position on it. And of course, at this time, evangelical churches, mainline churches, are all dividing over this, right. Some going one way, some going the other. I started realizing that the only way to have a firm position on it, or to have to make not an almost arbitrary decision, was a kind of a magisterium. That's why the Catholic Church was so firm in its position on that. I came to realize was that, it's not just making an ad hoc decision based on a hot button issue at the moment. It's rooted in this long tradition, not only of moral philosophy, but also of philosophical anthropology that goes right to the root of the way that the Catholic intellectual tradition understands what is a human being, what is sexuality for, all these kinds of questions, and so I started looking more deeply into the Catholic tradition. I should also say at the time as well, in 2011, I began a master's program at St. John's College in Annapolis, which, for those who are familiar, it's a great books program. And so in this program, you basically read through the Western canon from Homer through Nietzsche. And so you just kind of, you're reading Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Locke, Hobbes, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the first time I've really engaged Aquinas and Augustine. And so at the same moment, by God's grace, that I'm working through these questions, I'm realizing there are resources in the Christian tradition by which to think about them, through which to think about them. And so I'm thinking through Augustine, I'm thinking through Aquinas, I'm reading about secondary literature on Aquinas's metaphysics, and trying to understand what he's talking about when I'm thinking about what is sexuality for. How do I think about it teleologically? How do you think about the morality in terms of natural law and all these kinds of things? And so I'm realizing that the resources that I need to think about these hot button questions of the day that I'm being almost forced to make a decision on, at least in my own mind, the resources for that are in the Catholic tradition.
Yeah. It was this issue of magisterium, mm-hmm. that I think when you're outside the church, you might think, well, it's just another group of reasoners. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking that one way of understanding it is to think about, you can have the old rifle, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. where you have a shot and gunpowder and a little patch, the way they did in the old days, where they just hit it and it explodes. Mm-hmm. Well, if you had that and you have a bullet there and it just explodes, it's just going to go wherever.
Sure.
But if you want it to go there, you mm-hmm. put in front of that a rifled barrel.
That's right.
So that this explosion is directed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not going out here, it's going there. And when it comes out of that barrel, it has a trajectory.
Sure.
That's kind of like the magisterium.
That's right. That's right.
based on revelation. Scripture is revelation.
Absolutely.
But unless you have that trajectory, it's going to go wherever you want it to go.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And so understanding that, in some sense, sola scriptura is not enough, because I realize that Protestants of all sorts, evangelicals, and again, this was the flashpoint issue that made me realize that I saw Protestants, mainline and evangelical, reading the same Bible that I was reading, and that each other were reading, and coming to radically different perspectives on what it says about this particular issue. And so it's the issue that put it into stark relief for me, and it also made me realize that I needed to marry my wife, or figure that part of my life out. And so I went to her and I said, we need to either get married or we need to fix this, figure out something else. And I'm pretty sure I'm heading this direction into the Catholic Church, and if you can join me in that would be fantastic. And if not, then we need to talk seriously about that. And she was raised Catholic, but had gone away from it for a long time. And but I would say raised Catholic, but not undevout, but sort of just culturally Catholic kind of thing.
The externals.
Yeah, sure.
Through the hoops.
Precisely. Right. Yeah. And so I told her that this is where I'm going, and I'd love for you to come with me. And if we do that, then we need to get married sooner rather than later. And if we don't do that, then we need to figure out something else. And thanks be to God, she's now my wife. We have a 2-year-old daughter. We were married in 2014. We were married actually by my childhood pastor, because I was not yet Catholic, but our marriage was later convalidated in the church after I came into the church. So back to the specifics of how I came in. So I had all these things I was putting together, thinking.
Why don't we pause there?
Sure.
Let's pause there, because I was going to ask you, what were the key things that opened your heart to the church? What were some of the barriers that stood in the way?
Sure.
We'll come back after the break.
Sounds good.
And do that. And before we take a break, I just want to tell you that we have on our website, on chnetwork.org, a number of signposts, short vignettes, and a few insight videos that feature Shaun. So if you go to chnetwork.org, amongst all the other stuff that's there, you could see those short programs that we've featured Shaun in. So, but we'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Shaun Rieley. During the break, we were just catching up, because remember, he was been in the punk rock way back there. I was wondering what was still happening, what happened to that as conversion. But
I still get into it now and then. The band I mentioned, in fact, the last time we played was about 2 years ago. So we still get it together now and then. Of course, we're all married, have kids, jobs, and so forth. So it's a little harder than it was when we were teenagers, but we still get out there now and then. Yeah.
I wanted to lead us to what drew you into the church specifically, and maybe barriers, but it does seem like the issue of music and art and beauty was a big part of that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's right. When I started thinking philosophically, intellectually about it, you encounter this. The transcendentals, as they call them. So truth, beauty, and goodness, right? And so connecting the idea that all of these things are connected. But it took a lot of reflection to kind of understand what that meant. You encounter this in the kind of some of the apologetic literature sometimes. but not really understanding how that came together. And so it took some reflection. It was only later that I realized that, when I pinpointed that St. Patrick's visit, for example, that I started realizing, oh, this is what is meant by the kind of the drawl of the beauty, and the way that beauty connects with truth, connects with goodness, and that morality connects with truth, connects with back to beauty, and that it's all of a piece, and that when one of these things is out of alignment, then the others tend to be out of alignment as well.
I was just thinking back to that analogy we talked about earlier about the rifle, that the lie that beauty is only in the eye of the beholder is like the explosion without the rifled barrel.
Yes, that's right.
It's just wherever.
Sure.
Everybody defines beauty what it is, and so we end up with chaos, as opposed to the idea, which was really new to me too when I on the journey of the Catholic Church, this idea that there is beauty.
Yeah.
There's a defined what is beautiful, what is true.
Sure. And it's connected, and it connects to morality, and it connects, it's all of a piece. And it all connects, again, going back to the philosophical anthropology. It all sort of traces back to human nature. What do you think human nature is? And once you start drawing those lines, then at least for me, it all started falling into place. But I'll say the particular impetus was a name that some know. Father Arnie Panula was the director of the Catholic Information Center. I did not meet him on my visits across the street when I was at the American Legion. I did meet him at a mutual friend's home at dinner one time. We were both guests there, and I told him that I was interested, curious about the church, and so he gave me his card, and I emailed him, and we set up a time to come talk, and so he gave me a copy of the Catechism, and he said, just read it, and we'll come back in a month or so, and we'll talk. Of course, I did not realize until after he passed away, and with all of the EWTN and others did these tributes to him, I didn't realize how kind of big of a deal he was, right? Because he was so humble that he gave somebody like me, who was just kind of off the street, the time of day to sit here and work through my hesitations or questions or whatever it was. And so he and I, we started the process. We worked through started working through the Catechism a little bit at a time, just a little bit at a time. And every time I would come back, I would say, okay, this all made sense to me. Here's my background. Help me understand this part compared to what I had understood. So just patiently kind of walked through, and at the end of the day, I came to realize that I didn't have any serious objection, rightly understood, that I didn't really have any objections that I could seriously make. That didn't mean everything perfectly made sense, but I realized that the authority of the Magisterium was such that it once you accept the authority of Magisterium, then everything else kind of falls into line. Yeah. And so a lot of the things that Protestants wrestle with, say the Marian doctrines, which are a big one. It was a struggle for me only until I realized that the Magisterium is what it is. And once you realize that, at least for me, I how could I object, right? Yeah. It's because the Church, guided by the Holy Spirit, has said that this is the way we should understand it. So how could I believe otherwise? Who am I to believe otherwise?
For so many, the Marian doctrines, dogmas come into place again. Back to that analogy, of the rifled barrel when you go from our Lord to his apostles to the early church fathers. You see this trajectory.
Absolutely.
Did the early church fathers have an impact on you in that, seeing the foundation for some of those beliefs?
To be perfectly honest, I'd say only just recently getting into the church fathers, as I, in the way that I should. But St. Augustine for sure. I read Confessions first. I read that as part of my master's program at St. John's, and then of course read other things by him. City of God, not all of City of God. It's large, but worked kind of through it without reading every word, and still continue to. In fact, it's in the other room right now as we speak. Once you start understanding that the conceit, I think, of Protestant, especially evangelical Protestantism, is that somehow we're going to eliminate history, and we're going to go right back to the early church, and the early church, all of these accretions that the Catholic Church brings to their worship and to the liturgy and so forth are not authentic somehow. And I came to realize in revisiting the early church that actually that's not exactly true. These things do go right back to the very earliest Christians. And St. Augustine is early, but not that early, relatively speaking. He dies in 430, I think, and so that's it's not that early.
When you read him, you realize he's not creating these ideas. He's standing on the shoulders.
That's right.
Of a long line of very trustworthy men that are part of this line of Magisterium.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And he recognizes that there's a boundary there because of, or as again Tertullian, who in the end kind of went off a bit base, but the idea was, how do I know that this is true? Because it comes from a church of an apostle.
That's right. But what I will say about St. Augustine is that it's true that he builds on that magisterium. But the other great thing about him is that he's not afraid to engage with all of the other philosophical schools. He addresses Cicero. He addresses the Platonists. He addresses all of these things, and he says, look, they have some truths that we should consider. Because their natural reason allowed them to get at some truths. And so we can both learn from them, but also reject them when we must. And by the way, we can do it not exactly on their own terms, but we needn't be afraid to engage them philosophically as well as theologically, because what we have is more powerful. And so, it's not this kind of, he wasn't afraid to think philosophically. And that was another important thing, I think, for me. And I'd take Thomas Aquinas as well, right? Bringing in Aristotle, and showing how Aristotle can help us think about our faith and what the meaning of transubstantiation, the things like consubstantial, all these words that we use, understanding that he's using these philosophical concepts to convey Christian truth, and so we need to be scared of them, because if Christ is the Logos and God is the maker of all things, then we needn't be afraid of anything that bears the Logos.
And Augustine's a great example of God preparing him because of his background and experiences as a Manichaean and all that thing.
Sure.
To be able to fight the faith against the Donatists. He's equipped.
That's right.
And I love that phrase. I think it was Augustine. In essentials unity.
Yeah.
Non-essentials, diversity, all things charity.
Yeah.
I think it was Augustine.
I think it's actually a 17th century paraphrase of Augustine.
Okay,
but yes.
But it gets down to the issue. Okay, essentials unity. Well, then how am I going to determine what's essential?
That's right.
There's the key. How do I determine what is essential. And once I have that boundary of what's essential, then it allows me to have that diversity as, I mean, Augustine and Aquinas don't exactly overlap. There are areas where, Aquinas is a little more Aristotle and Augustine's a little more Plato. So I mean, you have a little bit of their overlap where they don't.
That's right. But at the same time, Aquinas is also an Augustinian in a manner of speaking. He quotes Augustine more than any other thinker, including Aristotle, except Scripture. Scripture is the only thing he quotes more than Augustine. And so, you're right. There's a diversity, but there's also a unity as well. And so you can see the trajectory that they both are on, even as they give expression to different kind of forms, different understandings.
Now, I'm assuming your wife came home with you?
Well, she was already, like I said, she was already Catholic.
So she returned.
She's returned. That's right. Yeah.
What was the hardest? What was the biggest barrier for you two as you were you for the first time thinking of a Catholic and her coming back?
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of doctrinal barriers, but I'd say more. Again, once you determine that the Magisterium is true, then that part kind of goes away. And I think at least for me, I think the hardest part was learning to think liturgically, sort of learning to structure your life around the church, the life of the church. Learning to understand the different seasons, and it wasn't so much a barrier; it was just it's trying to shift your mindset and to understand the way that the church sort of understands how time works and the rhythms of the season and that sort of thing. The moral teachings, I was already in agreement with them. I only needed the resources to determine how to defend, how to rightly think about them. And so, I think the hardest part has been to learn to think with the church, just in terms of how to structure our lives and that kind of thing. Which I will admit can still at times be a struggle.
I've talked to many converts over the years, and obviously, that's kind of what happened. But there's that old phrase, I believe, help my unbelief. That long journey of that, because we come from different traditions.
Yes,
and
yes.
Sometimes I think for converts, it seems that one of the hardest times is when you're alone in your prayer closet.
Yeah.
And now it's not just all the show. It's here I am, Lord.
That's right.
Or here I am, Our Lady.
That's right.
Or Saint Joseph. And moving into that spirituality. How was that for you in that journey?
Yeah, I think it's. I
was going to say, it's one thing for the Magisterium to say this is true.
Yes.
Okay, that's up here, but
that's right.
Now,
getting it in your heart, in your prayer life. I think. I never viewed my conversion into Catholicism as a rejection of anything before. I viewed it as a continuation. There's a book that I read actually on my sort of conversion journey by Father Dwight Longenecker, which is called More Christianity, Finding the Fullness of the Faith. And his story is not the same, but he had come from a somewhat similar background, I gather, and so that was very helpful for me to sort of developing it as this is not. It's not a rejection, it's a fullness, it's a fulfillment of all that sort of thing. I do think that prayers to the saints was a bit of and even Our Lady was, I wouldn't say a hurdle, but understanding how that was important, how that works. And I understand now there's sort of there's two different understandings.
Yeah, I remember when I was learning how to pray the rosary, I kept asking, where's my mind supposed to be
Yeah, yeah.
as I'm doing
Sure,
this?
Sure,
You know, what-
sure. Exactly. Yeah, because there is a lot of focus in sort of evangelical Protestantism on the centering of them. The every head bow, every eyes closed is the sort of phrase you hear a lot, and the idea is, I suppose, that you're supposed to be focusing your mind on something or other, and so the sacramental aspect of it. But in another sense, I would say I found it liberating in this way, that I sometimes struggled with focusing my mind, and I would find myself beating myself up because I said, "Oh, I wasn't focused enough during that moment," and that
thinking
sort of
about
thing.
the football game.
Yeah, exactly. And so I realized the sacramentality of it means that it's not about me. It's not about how focused I was on at that particular moment. It's about what's happening, in an ontologically real way on the altar, and I'm privileged to participate in it, but it doesn't depend on me, focusing enough. Or
It's interesting you brought that up. I was just talking to our producer, Matt Swaim, earlier about this other issue, and even though the Magisterium says this, it sometimes takes converts a long time to fully realize that worship and sacrifice are synonymous.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because your previous worship at Evangelical, there was no sacrifice there. And so when you become a Catholic, we think what's a part of it. That's what worship is.
That's right.
At its core.
That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
for yourself coming to that journey.
Yeah. The understanding of the Mass as the summit of the Christian life, and of course of every worship service, is and understanding that what the Mass it taking seriously.
Yeah.
That actually, now that I think about it, that was probably, it wasn't an intellectual sticking point, because I'd read Thomas Aquinas on transubstantiation and so forth, but it was a kind of a learning to have this disposition toward it, that the reverence that it deserved, based on what I already knew intellectually. So again, a lot of it, going all the way back to my kind of intellectualization and the split, I guess you might say, between my personal life and what I knew to be, or I thought to be true at the time, in my mind. I guess in some sense the church brings you, because of the sacramental nature of it, it brings you in and shows you how to act in accordance with. And so that's, to me, that's what the Mass and the Eucharist
It takes time to fully appreciate that, which I think is one of the reasons, the wisdom of the church, for example, given the work we do in the Coming Home Network, when we help a non-Catholic clergyman come into the church, it may be that God's calling that man to be a priest, but it ain't tomorrow.
Right.
It's, let's give this time to ferment for you to really truly understand first what it means to be a layman in the church, and to appreciate all these things you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it really is it's not just a changing of the mind; it's a changing of the habits. The disposition. It's all of these. Again, that's why I talk about the liturgical calendar and understanding the different times and seasons throughout the year, and even the way that the scripture readings at Mass are carefully laid out, which often is the case in evangelical Protestantism, that whatever the sermon is just about whatever the pastor happened to be thinking about that day, or that week, which is fine as far as it goes, but it's when you understand that all these things are carefully laid out in accordance with this liturgical calendar that has meaning, deep meaning, not only for the way we think, but the way we live in a particular moment.
Yeah, if the congregation is just waiting to hear what happens to be on the minister's mind this week, he may never get around to John chapter 6.
Yeah.
But when you have a liturgical calendar, there your whole flow.
Sure.
You were talking a bit about your PhD work.
Yeah.
When my father was alive, he wasn't a practicing Christian, and I remember I'm always trying to figure out ways to get him open to the faith. And I remember one day asking him, Dad, if you lived in the 16th century, so back in the Reformation year, he was a real reader in history. You know, what man of that time would you, rises to the occasion for you, rises to the level of importance of that? And so I'm wondering if he's going to go Luther, Calvin. He said Thomas More.
Yeah.
I said, why was that? Because he was a man of integrity.
That's right.
How much did Thomas More have to do with your own journey and your growth in the faith?
Well, actually, I only discovered Thomas More in my doctoral work. So, as you mentioned, I'm doing a PhD at Catholic University in political theory, and so I'm working. I'm examining the political thought of Thomas More, but I sort of knew who he was, but I hadn't really read him. The thing that most people read of Thomas More is Utopia, which is a very weird book. A lot of people read it and go, "What the heck did I just read?" And yeah, absolutely. But the thing about More is that he was a man of integrity. He was a powerful man in his time. He was the Lord Chancellor of England, second only to the King. But he was a man of integrity, as you say. He who challenged the King on a point of political point that was also a point of church doctrine, which caused lots of consternation and ended up with him losing his head. But even in the face of that, he was unbending. But not, see, here's the thing about More, though, that there's a kind of a 20th century narrative that developed about him in things like Man for All Seasons, the play, which is a great play, by the way, but and a great movie. But the notion of conscience that's portrayed there is not right, I think. The notion of conscience that's portrayed there is almost, he says at one point in the play, it's not that I believe it, it's that I believe it. Right, the I is put the center at front and center, but conscience means knowing with. If you look at the Latin root, conscientia, so it's a knowing with, and so More's idea of conscience is not this sort of postmodern willfulness. It's a knowing with the broader church, and this is, I think, rightly understood. This is what the meaning of utopia is, and it's also the core of his works writing against Luther and Tyndale and the other reformers. And so not somebody that was crucial to my conversion, but somebody who's become very important to me later.
Affirming it later, yeah.
Yes.
That's like you said, so many people begin with Utopia.
Yeah.
The book that I most like by Thomas More is the only book he wrote in English. It's called Dialogue with a Heretic.
That's right.
And it's the same exact apologetics that we use today.
Yes.
He was using 500 years ago.
That's right. C.S. Lewis calls that the greatest Platonic dialogue written in English ever. So
yeah, I recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's an awesome book.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's say someone's out there right now watching who is at where you were. Why should they make the same journey home that you've made?
Well, I think that, most fundamentally, because the teachings of the church are true. that's the short answer. The longer answer would be that if you are, the teaching of the church, help give, again, structure to your life. It gives moral meaning, and it gives truth. And there really is as almost as shallow or as deep as you want to go. And the beauty of the church is that the person in the pew who receives the sacrament receives the same sacrament that the philosopher, the learned philosopher reads, and so we all have access to this, and so you can go as deep as you want with it, but you have access to it, at any level. So,
All right. Thank you very much, Shaun.
thank you very much.
Appreciate you having on the program. And,
Appreciate it.
and God bless you as you finish that PhD program,
Thank
right?
you.
You got
Thank
that
you.
paper to write. Right?
Yes, working on it, working hard, working hard.
All right, very good. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. Once again, I remind you about going to our website, chnetwork.org, where there's a whole bunch of conversion stories, but also, as I mentioned earlier, a number of our signposts and insight videos that feature more about Shaun's journey. So thank you for joining the program. God bless you. See you again next week.